Thanks for being here. My name is Trevor Stewart Hill, and I'm going to show my age by telling you that I was the original, or on the original, advisory board for HSMAI's Revenue Management Advisory Board. So that was how many years ago? Because 3 years ago, one or 2 years ago, and it was about, what, 12 years ago?
I'm 8 myself too.
Yeah, Kathleen and I worked on that together. So anyway, I'm supporting HSMAI's ROC conference this year as a content coach for the planning committee. And in my day job, I'm president of a company called Revenue Matters. We're a revenue management advisory firm. Today's sessions are not possible without the support of our silver partners. And today's silver partner for our session is Brian Berry. He's Senior Vice President of Sales, Data, and Analytics for Cvent. Brian, can I ask you to stand for just a minute? And I want you to thank you very much for your sponsorship of this event. We'll try to make it impactful for you. Also, please seek Brian out at the break as well if you'd like to have some individual conversations. So I think it's really appropriate that we are here in Texas. Any idea why? Because the term RevPAR was invented in Texas. In fact, until September 1st of 2017, every hotel in Texas on the comptroller's webpage, the revenues for the year or for the month or the period were displayed at that point. So a very creative gentleman by the name of Bruce Walker in 1987, working for La Quinta in a marketing role, said, hey, this is probably useful information that we can gather here. So he went out and went onto the comptroller's website, pulled back the information that he needed, and then he could obviously make some assumptions around occupancy and make some assumptions around average rate and come up with what the statistics of the hotel industry would look like within his competitive set. So fast forward all the way from 1987 to 1988, where Randy and Caroline Smith with Smith Travel Research published the very first STAR report. So RevPAR being a key metric, obviously occupancy and average rate. The discipline obviously has evolved since then. We're much more reactive back in those days. Now we're much more proactive, and I think we heard from the owner representations sessions that we had earlier today that hoteliers and owners are looking for revenue management role to be evolving from being a reactive discipline to be much more proactive and generating and optimizing performance of an asset through all market conditions. Not only revenue performance, but also profitability of the asset. So some of the original metrics that we've had may not cut the mustard today. Times are changing. So since that discipline has evolved, we've got a highly esteemed panel here that's going to help us understand a little bit more about other metrics that might be relevant for our discipline today. And I am a Mac guy, so I'm struggling with my Dell computer, truth be told. I think we're in good shape now. That's excellent. I'd like to introduce the panelists, starting with Linda to my left, your right, who tells a little bit about herself and why this particular topic is of importance to her. Linda?
Sure. My name is Linda Golrajani. I'm the Vice President of Revenue Strategy and Distribution for Marcus Hotels. I think the topic is really important to me just because as revenue management continues to grow to things outside of room revenue, we need new metrics to measure our performance.
Very good. And we also have Kathleen.
Hi, Kathleen Cullen from Two Roads Hospitality. I'm in charge of revenue and distribution for the company. I think that this is an important topic because as the industry evolves and as the landscape changes, there are so many more costs involved, so many more players involved, that we have to take a look at what true success is. Today the focus is mostly on the top line, but as we heard in the owners panel this morning, true success really comes from the bottom line.
Fantastic, and welcome, thank you. John and I go way back as well. John, welcome.
Notice he said we go back a long time. So yeah, I graduated from college last year.
Perfect.
I've been in the business now for 39 years. I'm John Hack, Senior Industry Analyst for TravelClick. Why this matters to me, I can't make this stuff up. Several years ago, I was in the corporate office of Hyatt, and we were talking about an advertising campaign, and one of our best clients said, John, remember, I only want to buy the impression. that creates the booking. Right? So people say right time, right person, right offer. Well, how do you make that happen? So it's become a quest for us, a passion, and I'm pleased to be on the panel today to talk a little bit more about it. Thanks,
Fantastic.
Trevor.
We're excited to hear from you for sure. Eric and I met this morning for the first time, I think, right?
Well, that's not entirely true, and I'll get to that.
Okay.
My name is Eric Ravel. I'm with Diamond Resorts. I'm the timeshare guy, and so I look at data just a little bit differently. And I met Trevor years ago, and I'd really like to thank you for moderating this for us today.
My pleasure.
He was the first revenue manager that I ever worked for, and it is true, I may have short-sheeted his bed when he came to my property.
That might have happened.
May have happened.
Very good. Excellent. So here are your panelists. Just a quick round of applause for all of them to be joining us today. We're going to jump into some questions that I have prepared for the panelists just to get some additional information going here. But this session is all about you. We'd really like to have your participation. We have Susan here wandering with the microphone. So if you do have a question anytime during the session, please just raise your hand. I'll kind of keep one eye out for you as well. I'll ask Susan to come around, and please do participate and make this as interactive as possible. Deal? All right. Excellent. So I tell you what, Linda, let's start with you. So if practitioners want to move past RevPAR as a metric of success, jumping straight into maybe net RevPAR as an alternative metric might seem logical, but what are some pitfalls in just jumping into net RevPAR?
Well, I think first and foremost, as we've tried to do it, we've found a lot of discrepancies in our accounting that makes it challenging to do that. But I think the bigger challenge is just trying to get to the right level of granularity as you look at transient and group, and trying to take the output of that and use it to make decisions that would change your strategy to improve your net RevPAR. It's one thing to get net RevPAR, it's another thing to figure out what you do with it.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So Kathleen, we just heard from Linda about some pitfalls associated with jumping into net RevPAR. From your perspective as well, it's a little bit tricky. So what other costs do you think we need to think about as we are contemplating the concept of net RevPAR perhaps as an alternative metric or maybe an additional metric to traditional RevPAR?
Well, I think first everybody has to understand what net RevPAR is. So for Two Roads, we define net RevPAR as revenue after all acquisition costs are removed. So these are items such as commission, transaction fees, but also general sales and marketing costs that are not necessarily attributed directly to a reservation or a booking activity. So it's first defining that, and then really understanding how to use that information, and how are your competitors even using that information. As an industry, we're not really tracking it. So this is a new concept to all of us, but it's a super important concept because we can look one way on a STAR report, which today is the majority of how people measure their success. But then when you take the same data, drill it down into the net revenue, your results and your success can look very, very different depending on the mix of business.
So do you think it's fair to say that it's really the way you've described costs and coming up with your own version of how to get to a net RevPAR value, do you think it's fair to say in the short term that would be more an internal comparison, maybe across your portfolio from property to property, like properties, or maybe the same property against itself versus an industry benchmark? Or do you think there's even hope that we can make this more of a benchmark data point that everyone would agree to the methodology as to how we come up with that number?
Well, I think we have to get to using that as a benchmark as an industry, but today, to start off, it's critically important to have those discussions internally. It really will drive the strategic discussions in a much different way than what we do today, and the ideal is to get to a more profitable outcome. So understanding exactly what your cost of acquisition is, regardless of the channel, you have to understand what those costs are, what is your most profitable opportunity, how to shift some of your lower cost channels and drive more from higher costs to those lower costs. And it's really going to change our internal discussions. But I think the bigger piece and bigger opportunity for us as an industry is really to understand how we're comparing ourselves in that net profitability or that net revenue area to those of our competitors. So there are tools out there today. We can only be as good, though, as comparing ourselves to the competitors as those competitors are providing that information. So I think as more and more hoteliers start having those conversations and understand the importance of it and understand how to work with that data, hopefully companies will start more companies will start providing tools to allow us to measure it.
Excellent. And so for the entire panel then, do you think that there's be a difference perhaps between the way the brands would measure cost per channel and acquisition costs and marketing costs versus an independent property? So go ahead, John.
I think that was very well said, and I think where the Achilles heel in the industry right now, as you really think through this, is it's independents versus brands, but it's also booked revenue versus stayed revenue. And when you really start to examine the guest value at the folio level, whether it be a timeshare, whether it be a full-service hotel with food and beverage, it changes differently on your customer acquisition strategy. And the most advanced clients we're working with really do exactly as the guidance is. You look at an internal analysis and you know what your folio value is by channel. And then when you look at your book revenue, you can more accurately compare, okay, this guest is paying $90 a night, but actually they're really paying $150. And so that really changes your strategy as you start to look at what channels you open up and what you close off.
So John, is there a metric that you would rely on, since channels and distribution is really your world, to help understand return on channel investment, if that's the right term?
If we're doing accounting class, it's cost of goods sold by channel. So it's a COGS analysis. You go to your CFO and they're really into this, cost of goods sold. Net RevPAR is a hotel metric, but the point that you said that I just want to echo, and Eric, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, is when you start to look at industry benchmarks, it's really hard to compare because you have select service hotels, we've got timeshare in this. You have to have peer-to-peer measurements that have to be in a defined geographic area that are in a defined ADR band. Because the thing that's very frustrating for us when we look is it's very difficult to normalize data and have apples to apples comparison. If you have a resort hotel that's competing with an airport property, how are you going to do that? Is the data going to be credible? So, Eric, this kind of parlays into your world. Please give us some guidance.
Yeah, so in my timeshare world, of course, I'm still looking for the right guest at the right time at the right price. However, I need to find the guest that has the highest propensity to make a timeshare purchase. So we're back to the value per arrival, the value per guest. And we take a lot of time and energy into taking a look at every channel to see what the value is. So just as an example, an Expedia guest, an average Expedia guest plus their timeshare revenue total together is how I put this metric to paper. We will take all of the revenue generated by Expedia, all of their timeshare sales revenue, divide that by the arrivals per month, and you get your value per arrival. We'll do the same for our timeshare members too, which don't have a room rate. They've already paid to be part of the program. So it's the same calculation though. I'll have my room rate, which is 0, plus their timeshare sales revenue, divide that by arrivals, and then we have a value per arrival on that one too. Now we can sit down and analyze who's the best guest. We do have to take it a level deeper though, because my owners, when they stay with us, they have an average length of stay of approximately 6 nights. An Expedia guest will stay with us for 3 nights. So I can put in 2 guests in a 6-night time period from Expedia or 1 owner guest. So if I know the value of these guests, I can start deciding who's the right one to optimize my sales opportunity for my timeshare sales department. So it's something that we work through every day.
Linda and Kathleen, do you think principles that John and Eric have talked about in terms of value per arrival and I even say maybe conversion ratio of sales to arrival, could some of those things apply maybe in a resort environment or even a traditional hotel?
Yeah, talking to the brand piece that John talked about, I do think it's much harder to get to take action on net RevPAR with a branded hotel because you can't control your franchise fees, you can't control some of the marketing and some of the channels. So, To me, on the brand side, it's figuring out what you can control, what levers you can pull, but on the independent resort side, I think you have so much more opportunity. The other piece that I think you can control, both on the brand side as well as independent, is on group acquisition costs, which I don't think we talk about as much. But group costs are continuing to rise, and I don't think we've adjusted our sales labor at all. So I think there's definitely a lot of opportunity, whether it be branded or independent, to look at your sales acquisition costs and start to measure those.
Excellent. Okay, so let me ask you one more question, and I'm going to go to an audience question up here, Susan, if you don't mind. So Linda, you hadn't talked about the group acquisition costs. So we're talking about segmentation and maybe some metrics around different segmentation. Revenue per occupied group room or something along those lines, is that another metric that would be important maybe for practitioners to think about?
Sure, that's something that we use a lot in our organization. Totally not related to net RevPAR at all, but it helps you be able to forecast and budget and talk to your banquet revenue per group room. So it's just an easy way to look at, on a per room basis, how you're doing on the group side. But in order to get to that number, you have to make sure that you separate out your banquet and catering revenues to effectively do it. Because if you include catering, it just doesn't make as much sense.
Yeah, good, excellent.
If I
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I'm not sure
It should-
if my thing
Okay.
is it on now? So I just wanted to comment on one thing that Linda said, because I think it was an important point. We as an industry keep adding more and more costs onto our hotels, and more continues to erode the bottom line results. And we all have so much pressure from ownership to improve the bottom line. And as the landscape changes and more costs are pushed down upon us because everybody wants a piece of the pie, we as hoteliers really have to take a step back and take a look to say, okay, where can we redeploy some of our resources? Where can we have a little bit more efficiencies in how we do business? And I think how we book groups today is probably a really good opportunity. A lot of our sales force are becoming more, we'll call it order takers, because there's so much online today, work that they have to do sitting behind their desk versus going out and actually truly selling or being true marketers, no matter what their role is, that I think it's important for us to take a look at some of those opportunities and where are we putting some of those labor costs and where is their focus. So taking a step back, re-looking at how we're doing business today, and stop trying to put Band-Aids on it or piece it together. Take a step back, reassess it completely from the ground up, and see what works in today's landscape.
Fantastic, good. As promised, this is all about you and your input and questions. So we're going to start with Lauren, and we'd like to have other questions as well. So please, Lauren.
And this is sincere, and you alluded to with the occupancy versus availability. Most of the dialogue that you're referring to, it seemed like the occupancy functionality would be better for assignment and value proposition as to cost of acquisition versus just applying it to the availability functionality, which is to the perishable inventory perspective of it. So I'd love, because the assignment value seems to be the catch-all. It's like, how do you assign true value and cost of acquisition? And so you're moving into the modality of actual purchased product versus just inventory available for acquisition. So I'd love, just the occupancy versus availability thing, because to me, I'm tending to be on the occupancy side of things, saying, wow, let's assign it to the actual production that it created. That way the assigned value has a higher accuracy, but I'd love to hear.
And was it availability or was it based on arrival? I think it was...
So I think there's a, did everyone hear the question? So I think we're into this juncture, which is, to your point, it's a little bit of new terrain for the industry right now. And I think to broaden this and to bring in Eric's comment is length of stay, right? And value by guest. And again, going from a booked value to a stay value, and then having the assignment by channel that is in the owner's best interest. True? Okay, so that's kind of the holy grail of what we're trying to do, maximize RevPAR, right? The piece that I think is so interesting is go back to Eric's comment about length of stay and looking and comparing and contrasting two different types of guests and making that business decision of who am I going to allocate that room to.
Absolutely.
And what I can say right now definitively, when you look at the data, we're seeing the best demand data in the United States in 3 years. So when we look at the third quarter, when we look at opportunity growth for transient, for business, look across all the demand data, this environment, July, August, September, is absolutely the best environment we've seen in 36 months in the United States.
Interesting.
And then I go back to say, you really start to think about now, not just a 1 or 2 night guest, but go back and say, who can occupy that room, not only for the peak Wednesday stay, but for that 6 or 7 day period, so that I'm spreading my occupancy across those shoulder periods too that happen in every market. And I think that's what it is now, because the industry's changed so much within the last 12 months. We've gone from sporadic demand to continued demand, and now you're really into optimizing by length of stay. So that would be my postulate.
And I think it'd be important maybe to pivot, especially if the economist is right, and by 2020, all the lights are going off, right? What's going to happen then? It sounds to me as though having some fundamental metrics and business processes in place would be helpful, even in a maybe a downturn economy as well. So excellent.
I think AI will save the day.
Very good. Winner, chicken dinner.
Yeah, if I could add something to the conversation that hasn't been mentioned yet, but I think, when we're talking about net revenue, it's everything that we see on the P&L today in terms of how we're calculating our success, but we also as hoteliers need to move to the place where we're understanding what our missed opportunities are from the non-commissionable models or the merchant models, because we don't see that opportunity, that lost opportunity on our P&Ls. That is something that we're sharing that revenue with some of our partners, and there's a place for that, but we have to understand what that is doing to our opportunity cost, as well as where we can potentially become more profitable or get more revenue capture. So I think that is a piece that we as an industry also need to further understand and have some metrics to be able to compare how we're doing against our competitors in that particular area, as well as how we can shift some of those dollars to get them to book direct with us, return their stays with us next time. So I think that there are some good opportunities there.
Excellent. So hard costs, soft costs, and opportunity costs need to be factored into the equation. That's great. Excellent. So we've talked about sort of rear view mirror looking, and we just sort of briefly talked about trends and what might happen in the future as well. Are there some data points that would be important that would be more future oriented versus rear view mirror oriented or historical that we also should consider? So I'll open it up to any panelist.
I think that's something that the industry perhaps still struggles with. When I started with my company today, Two Roads, it was a previous company before that, but when I started with the company, a lot of focus was on historical information and not as much as the future information. So I had to take a look to see why that was, and part of that was because of the tools that we provided, right? The tools were all historical looking data. So we had to kind of change that narrative and help drive that conversation to look into the future. So just a few simple things, such as defining what your revenue meeting should look like. So how much time should be allotted to looking at your historical data, because that's important to understand what you did, what you didn't do, where your opportunities are, and how to improve those in the future. But then the majority of that discussion has to be focused on forward-looking data and what you're doing to impact that forward-looking data. So what are some of those tools that we have available today, much more than we ever had in the past? So incorporate those tools into your revenue meetings and make sure that you focus on that.
Great, John.
And I agree completely. I think along those lines, I've got a colleague that specializes in this, and one of her current views is trailing 3 months, current month, plus the next 2 months. So it's a nice snapshot of time, but you're looking at the past, the present, and the future. The reason you look out the 2 months in major markets is the difference between the group blocked and the group reserved. I'll use a very technical term called wonky. When you get outside that 60-day window on groups, the markets can change materially. So, to echo that point is trailing 3 months, current month, and then the next 2 right now seems to be an emerging best practice, because again, you're capturing past, present, and the near-term future, which has a better predictability than the longer-term business that can or cannot materialize.
Good. So pace and velocity sounds like,
Pace.
if you want to look at very specific terms, it sounds like what you're referring to.
Absolutely. I mean, even your definition of pace, because I think that one of the industry struggles today, people ask me this all the time, what is pace?
Yeah.
So Trevor, help us. Revenue matters, we know that, Trevor, right? Okay, so pace.
The benefit of being a facilitator is I don't get to contribute to the conversation, I just get to ask the questions. We have the paddlers here.
Yeah, but I think that's a good point, is everybody's going to define what their period of outlook needs to be, because, you know, for urban markets, shorter, you know, maybe 2 or 3 months is the ideal booking window, or the ideal window that we're looking at. But for your group heavy hotels, it's definitely, or your more destination type hotels, it's going to be further out into the future, because you are so reliant on your group booking pace.
Yeah.
Or citywide pace too.
Or citywide
It has a
pace.
huge impact in many markets.
And we also might, gosh, I want to contribute. I'll break the rule then. City markets, leisure resort markets that are air dependent or lift dependent might have a different best practice, right?
Yeah.
Well,
So let's, Eric, I'm going to
Yeah,
transition to you nicely.
Exactly. So I get the benefit of having timeshare owners who will book their reservations 12 to 13 months out. I mean, and that's awesome. There's your base. There's your airline crew business or your group business. I have that built in. And then you see your hills and valleys as you go along. But yeah, the resort locations, the islands, the beaches, people are planning farther out. And I think that's evolved a little bit over the past few years, but they're planning farther out. Now, we're still going to rely upon the last minute guest to fill in those gaps, but the booking window that I enjoy really helps fill the properties.
Excellent. What about, by the way, any other questions so far from the audience? Okay, if you scratch, then you're going to be answering a question. All right, very good. What about, so we talked about costs and guest value. Part of guest value, I think, is also consumer sentiment, right? And social media scores and sentiment analysis, and maybe that has some contribution towards pricing power or market power for a given asset. How do we think about that, just in general terms? Social media sentiment as it relates to as it relates to pricing power. Let's start with that.
I mean, I think it's really important in our pricing decisions because, guest feedback matters a ton. So, at one of the HSMAI Rocket events, they talked about a value index where you look at your value rating on like TripAdvisor and you compare it to your comp set's value to get an index, which helps you understand the value of your pricing against your comp set. So I think that's a start.
What's the formula on that, Linda? If I can just.
So it would basically just be your value rating divided by your comp sets.
Okay.
But I think it's a start. But I really think we don't in revenue management pay as much attention to consumer reviews and the scores that we probably should as it relates to the impact on pricing, because that's where people are looking.
Yeah. I agree. Sorry. I agree that.
I was ready to argue.
No, I agree that it's an important factor. I think that there are hotels that do a really good job. Within Two Roads, we actually have goals for every single hotel on where they should land on their TripAdvisor scores, for example. And it is part of the discussions within the revenue meetings, because it does make a difference. If your TripAdvisor reviews, if you're further down on the ranking, you're not answering your reviews, then that's going to negatively impact your ability, the revenue strategist ability, to be able to drive revenue for that hotel.
Yeah. So in the independent space, you're using that as an important metric, and
Yeah.
then I think in the branded space, the balanced scorecard is also maybe considering that as well. Eric, you had a counterpoint to that. Are there certain markets that you know of that maybe don't behave rationally?
So I have a smaller market. TripAdvisor has as a 49 property market. This property is going through renovations. It's in poor condition. So unfortunately, I rank 47 out of 49, which is a very bad place to be, especially if we're talking about benchmarking. But what's happened is, due to the size of the market, I'm the last to sell out. So that puts me in a great position. When there's any sort of compression or demand is up, I just start raising my ADR. My ADR in this poor, unfortunate property, which I do love, is actually higher than my luxury property in the same market. And it's just because of the opportunity I have based on the poor reviews and ranking, which we're fixing, just so you know. But
But at what pace, right?
it's a timeshare. It takes time. There's a board. Okay.
So we won't know the name of it, though.
No.
Protect the innocent. Excellent. I know we have some other questions from the audience that you're just dying to ask. So I'm going to give it another opportunity here for any brave soul. Oh, man, really? Okay, we'll keep going. Oh, good.
There's one.
Excellent. By the way, we have a microphone, so we'll just wait for just a second. We'll play Jeopardy music in the meantime.
So on metrics, we always talk about ROI, just talking about social media reputation. What about return on engagement? Do you guys measure that in any of your companies?
Return on engagement as an ROI metric. That's an interesting question.
So we other than Eric's property, right, we do see a causal relationship in sentiment analysis and conversion on return on ad spend. We actually did a study a couple of years ago with the Rosen School in Orlando, and to Eric's point, you start to look at an index, and you can definitely see engagement. And then, Linda said this, the better hotels, the best hotels, are personally managing the guest responses. It's not a generic response, it's an empathetic response, and some of this they're taking offline with that guest. Especially some of the hotels know how many followers they have, if they're active on Twitter, active on Facebook, because those reviews do matter. So we definitely see relationships. Our sales force is pretty aggressive at coming to us and saying, this ROI tanked. What are you going to do about it? And so one of the best practices, we go right away into TripAdvisor and we start to look. We recently did one for a very large client in a large metropolitan area that deflagged. They were a major brand that went independent. And the biggest thing that they lost was the currency of points. And it was amazing to see the causal effect, not only on the negative guest reviews, but also just because they couldn't give out points for the stay. Over 80% of their guests were loyalty members when they deflagged. So one of the remedies that we recommended was actually changing the comp set. And fortunately for them, within a 3-mile area, they had 15 other independent hotels that they could compete against. So by looking at the different audience, casting it differently, and really figuring out, now that I'm an independent, how can I compete? If I don't have a loyalty program, is my food and beverage better? Can I offer a late checkout? But those local differentiations, whether you may think that they're very small, and a lot of hoteliers, well, we know we have that. The question is, you know you have that, but does that prospective guest know you have that? And so that's when that sentiment analysis really matters, because you really have to redefine who you're competing with, what they have, and what you can do better.
Yep.
It materially changes the return on ad spend.
So that's a really interesting question, because in that scenario, John, obviously it sounds like revenues really went down significantly. And so trying to chase revenues that maybe aren't there wouldn't be inappropriate for a revenue manager. But if we're now focusing on more on the cost and understanding the net operating income and how net operating income translates to asset value, and that's really the role now that revenue management is taking, it sounds like having appropriate benchmarks, understanding the net operating impact, the impact that can have on asset value, and appropriately benchmarking that against a comp set that's relevant was the right move.
We literally had the owner of the hotel on the phone with us almost every day for a week, and it wasn't until we recommended a different comp set that you could finally hear the sigh of relief. Because again, 80% of their guests were loyalty members, and they didn't have that currency to use for check-in. But there are different ways to compete, and having those local differentiators, especially if you think that they're good, advertise them, because that's your strong point. Consumers want to know.
Excellent. So we're kind of getting into the, I mean, say the accounting side of the equation as well. So when we talk about the uniform system of accounts and how that is currently set up, and I know it's evolved over the course of time, specifically for a revenue management function, are there a couple things that we should be looking at that would be helpful for us to change within the uniform system of accounts? And by the way, I'll make this open to anybody on the panelists who are all avoiding me right now. Yeah. So who's the brave one who's going to answer that question?
You know, I'll take a stab.
Sure, thank you.
I'm not an expert on this particular topic, but what I will say goes back to a lot of what we were talking about at the beginning, which is understanding what all of those different costs are and being able to compare your own performance on a net revenue level compared to your competitors, So if we had very strict guidelines outlining exactly how things should be
Allocated, maybe?
allocated, thank you, then it would be easier for us to be able to get comparisons through some sort of reporting tool, easier than it is today, I should say, because today it is through the tools that are available out there, it is a very manual process, and you have to be very diligent at making sure that you're tracking everything properly, versus if you have strict guidelines, it would make it a lot easier to know that you're comparing apples to apples.
And one of the challenges, I think, coming back to what you said earlier, Kathleen, about opportunity costs being one of the three costs, the hard costs, the soft costs, and opportunity costs, is financial controllers don't like to work in a hypothetical environment with an opportunity cost. And even if they did, you've got variable margins associated with different contracts that have been negotiated. So that sounds like it could be problematic there as well, ultimately.
Yeah.
So, good, excellent. Yes, Lauren. And by the way, we have a microphone. Not that you need it,
I don't think Lauren needs a microphone.
but no, if you would like to stand and, oh, here you go. Okay.
One's coming.
Okay, since we're talking about alternative metrics, and I know we've had discussions about internet metrics and dialogue from times past and so forth, but venturing from that and keeping the AI conversation from earlier, from a humanistic side, what we put on paper is not always what we feel is completely the truth. We kind of keep ourselves a margin of predictability that we internally look at numbers. What are some things that when you look at the metrics that you review on a daily basis that create that gut check feeling? Those, it's not at the right pace, it's not at the right variance, it's not. What are some things within metrics that you look at? Because you look at I mean, you guys, between the properties that you have, tons of stuff, and you're flashing between reports. There's things that you're looking for. What are some of the gut check things that you guys look for that I guess would qualify as alternative metrics? Because it's not a quantifiable, it's just that's not what I thought it was supposed to be, or this isn't going where I'm going. Are there certain things that you look at that are just what you're like tab 4 and star on the star report kind of mentality? Are there things you look for that are your kind of prime indicators that you might want to dig deeper into something?
I give you one right away. It goes back to pace. It's, if you look at new reservations that are being generated in your local market on increments of 1 day, 4 days, 7 days, I look at pace almost like your pulse, and you have a resting pulse and an active pulse. And if you think about your competitors, and they're very active, right? You want to at least benchmark to them and a little bit better. So when we look at markets and say, okay, everyone's got a year-over-year variable, but what new reservations are coming into the market on a daily basis, and am I capturing my fair share of those? So it's that pace that's generated in 28-day increments, and that's the one that always catches my eye. Is this hotel running at the same pace or a better pace than its local competitors? So that's the first one I look at, is how is its pacing compared to its defined competitive set, and sometimes aspirational competitive sets. Because sometimes you want to look a little bit deeper in the data and you want to stretch it a little bit more, especially when there's business to be had, which is the kind of the environment we're in right now.
So it might be helpful to have a weaker pace to your competitors coming into a high demand period.
Well,
Or it could be more important to have a strong
Yeah.
pace coming into a weak period, I think.
It's a race, and so Eric goes back to that length of stay conversation, which I think right now it's because business is plentiful. We're really seeing a good environment is optimizing across the portfolio, but not just doing it by channel. Really looking at length of stay and length of stay pricing.
Sure, absolutely.
Excellent.
So can I offer
Certainly.
another perspective? So I really had to think about that and totally agree with everything you just said, but I would even take it back to that net revenue perspective. So what I like to look at is our revenue capture by brand, by company, by brand, by hotel. And to me, that is kind of a gut check of, okay, how are we doing? We know we have the segmentation mix for Hotel A. Perhaps they are higher on OTAs than, in my mind, I thought they were too high on OTAs, but when I take a look at the revenue capture year over year could have gone up, meaning that we're getting more of that net revenue. And so, and more of that margin cost as well. So that's kind of what I look for as some of the more recent trends that I'm looking for is how are we doing on that revenue capture piece, and is it matching up with what I thought a hotel was doing from a mix of business?
Okay, excellent, very good. 2 questions here, and then we're going to do a wrap-up. So I don't one over here.
I'm glad that we're talking about pace because I think for me, it's a huge contributing factor on how I feel like we're going to do moving forward and gives me a very good idea of where the hotel stands. How do you feel about some of the brands and the concept of revenue management moving away from pace being so important and moving more towards demand being more important in recognizing what's happening going forward?
Excellent.
So I think that's an excellent question, and one that we should all be talking about much more, because pace is extremely important, but it is definitely not the end-all be-all. You can purposely be behind pace compared to previous years or previous patterns, whatever it is you're looking at, because you know the demand is very different. You know your mix opportunity is very different. Therefore, your strategy could be one that you are holding off on pacing at the same rate because you know that there's better opportunities closer in.
Excellent. One more audience question, then we'll do a wrap-up, and then we'll invite the panelists to stay behind if they're able to for a few minutes for one-on-ones.
Hi, I'm coming from a destination resort. So anyway, that may help with the color of this question. What metrics do you ask for from other division and department leaders when you go into your regular meetings? What metrics do you expect from them on a regular basis that help you analyze what's going on with the broader picture?
Great.
Me? Or?
You want to go across?
Linda, why don't we?
Okay. I mean, I can try to answer that. I mean, we have one big resort that, frankly, I think it's my team who brings the data to the table. So they're going out and they're pulling golf, tee time data and revenue data. They're pulling spa data. They're starting to pull restaurant demand based on reservations booked through open tables. So honestly, I think they've given up asking other departments to bring data to the table, and they bring it themselves. So I don't know if that helps, but
I would tend to agree with that. I think that.
Sorry to interrupt you. Are there specific data points, alternative data points that would be important to bring to the table? So we're collecting certain things from spa, certain things from golf.
So for us, it's, we look at our occupancy in the hotel. We look at golf tee times booked. We looked at restaurant reservations. We look at spa services. And a lot of the reason for that is so that we can evaluate if we have a big group in-house that's using banquet function space, we need to fill our restaurant, our golf courses, our spa with local guests or other guests. So for us, I mean, that's the main purpose that we use those metrics for, is to really determine our marketing strategies, when we need to do special offers in the outlets or the golf course because we have a big group in-house. So that's our primary purpose.
Perfect. And Kathleen, you were about to say some specific metrics as well that you would like to do.
I don't think I have anything additional to add. I forget what I was going to say now.
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
So, but along those lines, should I appeal to the spa guest, to the golf guest, to the tennis guest? The one that always comes back to me is cost as a percentage of incremental contribution. You've got all these different marketing activities that you can allure guests with, right? But at the end of the day, which one's going to be most contributory to the bottom line? So cost as a percentage of incremental contribution.
Excellent.
And then for me, my team is bringing all of the hotel metrics to the table, but the other side of the game is the timeshare sales metrics. Once I have all of that, then we can truly sit down and optimize what our revenue and what our occupancy is going to be and how it'll fill the sales centers going forward.
So let's come back to one final metric that each of you would really stand behind and say, our audience today should really consider this metric and take it back and put it into their operations, the one that you feel most passionate about that will help advance the industry, advance the discipline. So I'll just go down the line. We'll start with you, Linda, on that one.
To me, it's GOPAR, or gross operating profit per available room. As you heard the owner panel say earlier, I mean, there's nothing more important than the bottom line, and I think that's the measurement that kind of sums it up.
Fantastic. Good.
Yeah. I'd like to see much more focus on net RevPAR.
Net RevPAR. As defined, yes, yeah, got it.
I'd say right now, based on current market conditions, mix optimization.
Mix optimization.
And we're looking into profit per night.
Profit per night, wonderful. Excellent. Linda, Kathleen, John, Eric, thank you very much for joining us today. Thoroughly enjoyed it.